Same table. Two men, two different worlds. One was Kirk Douglas, the son of Jewish immigrants who had grown up in crushing poverty, a man who knew firsthand what discrimination felt like. The other was Louis Armstrong, born in the poorest neighborhood of New Orleans, a man who had experienced every form of prejudice imaginable, yet never stopped smiling. In 1949, these two men walked through the doors of one of Hollywood's most exclusive restaurants side by side as equals. Kirk Douglas had a debt to pay. Just weeks earlier, Louis Armstrong had saved his career with a single 6-hour trumpet lesson when 3 teachers had quit and the studio was ready to fire him from Young Man with a Horn. Now, Kirk wanted to say thank you, not with a card or a phone call, but with a statement that all of Hollywood would see. The manager was about to say no. The other diners began to whisper. A young waitress named Helen stood frozen, menus trembling in her hands. But Kirk Douglas did not care about rules or customs or the way things had always been done. That afternoon, in that restaurant, something extraordinary was about to happen that would change lives forever. If you believe that kindness can change the world and that courage comes in many forms, make sure to subscribe to this channel. This is a story you will never forget. But to understand why Kirk Douglas felt so compelled to make this gesture and why it meant so much to Louis Armstrong, we need to go back a few weeks to the moment when their paths first crossed in a meaningful way. The information in this video is compiled from documented interviews, archival news, books, and historical reports. For narrative purposes, some parts are dramatized and may not represent 100% factual accuracy. We also use AI-assisted visuals and AI narration for cinematic reconstruction. The use of AI does not mean the story is fake. It is a storytelling tool. Our goal is to recreate the spirit of that era as faithfully as possible. Enjoy watching. 1949 was supposed to be Kirk Douglas's breakthrough year. Warner Brothers had cast him as the lead in Young Man with a Horn, a film about a troubled jazz trumpet player. It was a prestigious role that could elevate him from promising newcomer to genuine movie star. There was just one problem. Kirk Douglas could not play the trumpet. The first trumpet teacher lasted 2 weeks before declaring Kirk hopeless. The second made it 10 days. The third quit after just 1 week. Hedda Hopper, the powerful gossip columnist, wrote a devastating piece suggesting that Kirk was in over his head and that Warner Brothers was considering replacing him. Kirk was devastated. He had overcome a childhood of poverty and discrimination to build a career in Hollywood. His father had been a ragman. Kirk had put himself through drama school working as a waiter. Every role he had fought for with everything he had. And now, it was slipping away. Have you ever faced a moment when everything you worked for seemed about to disappear? Let us know in the comments. Kirk's production assistant Jerry believed in his boss completely. He had seen Kirk work 18-hour days preparing for roles. He could not accept that this trumpet situation would end Kirk's chance at stardom. So Jerry did something unexpected. He sent a message to Louis Armstrong. At this point, Louis Armstrong was already a living legend. He had revolutionized jazz, toured the world, and become one of the most recognized faces on the planet. The idea that he would drop everything to help a struggling actor seemed almost absurd, but Louis Armstrong was not like other celebrities. He remembered what it felt like to be desperate, to need someone to believe in you. So when Louis received Jerry's message, he did not hesitate. 31 hours later, he was standing at Kirk Douglas's door. What happened over the next 6 hours became Hollywood legend. Louis did not teach Kirk how to actually play trumpet. Instead, he taught him something more valuable. He taught Kirk how to feel like a trumpet player, how to hold the instrument with casual confidence, how to move his fingers with natural rhythm. Louis was patient in ways the previous teachers had never been. He shared stories about learning to play in reform school, about mentors who believed in him. He made Kirk laugh and relax. And slowly, Kirk began to transform into someone who looked like he belonged with a trumpet. If you're enjoying this story, please like this video and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to you. By the end of those 6 hours, Kirk could convincingly portray a trumpet player on screen. The studio was satisfied. The production moved forward. And Kirk knew he owed his career to a man who had no obligation to help him. In the weeks that followed, Kirk could not stop thinking about what Louis had done. It was not just the trumpet lesson. It was the way Louis had treated him with respect and warmth and genuine care. Kirk had been in Hollywood long enough to know such kindness was rare. Kirk wanted to express his gratitude but struggled to figure out how. Louis did not need money or connections. The answer came to Kirk in the middle of the night. He would take Louis to lunch at one of Hollywood's most exclusive restaurants, publicly acknowledging his debt. But Kirk knew the complication. In 1949, many Hollywood establishments did not welcome black customers. Louis could perform at prestigious venues but often could not eat nearby. Kirk knew this, and he knew that taking Louis to lunch would be a statement. Kirk dialed Louis's number and got straight to the point. He wanted to take Louis to lunch at a restaurant on Sunset Boulevard, one of the most fashionable spots in Hollywood. There was a pause. Louis understood immediately what Kirk was proposing. He told Kirk it might cause problems. Kirk's response was firm. He said they would walk in together, sit together, and eat together. If anyone had a problem, it would be their problem. Louis laughed that famous warm laugh and said he would be honored to join him. Something about Kirk's invitation felt different to Louis. Here was a man who had experienced discrimination himself, who understood what it meant to be judged unfairly, and who was willing to put his reputation on the line. On the day of the lunch, a 19-year-old waitress named Helen Dawson woke before dawn. Helen's life had not been easy. Her father had not returned from the war, leaving her mother to raise 2 children alone. Helen had dropped out of school to help support the family. The restaurant was not an easy place to work. The rules were clear about who was welcome. Helen had seen servers fired for small mistakes, customers turned away for reasons that had nothing to do with their behavior. She kept her head down and did her job. That morning, Helen had no idea her life was about to change. She took her position in the section near the windows, straightened the silverware, and prepared for another ordinary day. Have you ever had a day that started ordinary but ended up changing everything? Share your experience in the comments. Shortly after noon, the front door of the restaurant opened and Kirk Douglas walked in. The hostess smiled warmly, recognizing him immediately. Kirk Douglas was a regular customer and a rising star whose face was becoming increasingly familiar to moviegoers across America. But then the hostess noticed the man walking beside Kirk, and her smile faltered. Louis Armstrong was unmistakable. That face, that smile, that presence that seemed to fill any room he entered. But Louis Armstrong was also clearly a black man, and this restaurant, like many establishments in 1949 Hollywood, did not serve black customers. The hostess looked around nervously, unsure what to do. She could see the manager already moving toward the entrance, his expression tight with concern. Kirk and Louis stood in the doorway, waiting to be seated, acting as if nothing unusual was happening. Kirk had a pleasant smile on his face, the same smile he wore in his movies, confident and charming. Louis stood beside him with quiet dignity, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes taking in the room with calm interest. The other diners had begun to notice. Conversations trailed off. Forks paused midway to mouths. The restaurant fell into an uncomfortable silence. The manager reached Kirk and Louis before the hostess could figure out what to do. He was a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, his face arranged in an expression of professional regret. He began to explain in a low voice meant not to carry that while he had the utmost respect for both gentlemen, the restaurant had certain policies and perhaps there was another establishment that might be more suitable for their dining needs. Kirk Douglas listened to the manager's explanation with that same pleasant smile still fixed on his face. When the manager finished speaking, Kirk responded in a voice that was quiet but carried clearly to the nearby tables. He said that he and his friend Louis Armstrong were going to have lunch at this restaurant at a table by the window and that they would like a bottle of the best wine the establishment had to offer. He said it as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if the idea of being refused had simply not occurred to him. The manager hesitated. He was caught between the restaurant's policies and the reality that Kirk Douglas was a valuable customer, a movie star whose presence attracted other famous patrons. Making a scene by refusing to seat him would cause problems, but seating Louis Armstrong would cause different problems. Problems with other customers, problems with the owners, problems that the manager did not want to deal with. Helen Dawson had been watching this confrontation. From across the room, her heart pounding, she knew the restaurant's rules. She knew what was expected of her, but she also knew that what was happening at the entrance was wrong, that turning away a man simply because of his skin color was something that made her deeply uncomfortable, even if she had never had the courage to say so out loud. The manager was still hesitating when Helen made a decision that would change her life. She picked up 2 menus, walked across the restaurant to where Kirk and Louis were standing, and said that their table was ready if they would follow her. Her voice was steady, but inside she was terrified. She knew she might lose her job. She knew the manager might fire her on the spot. But something had shifted inside her, and she could not bring herself to stand by and do nothing. Kirk Douglas looked at Helen with an expression of surprise and gratitude. Louis Armstrong's smile widened into something genuine and warm. They followed Helen across the restaurant to a table by the window, exactly as Kirk had requested. The manager stood frozen for a moment, then seemed to decide that the situation had moved beyond his control. He turned and walked away without another word. Kirk and Louis sat down at the table Helen had provided, and for the next 2 hours they had lunch. They talked about music and movies, about their childhoods and their dreams, about the strange and wonderful paths that had brought them both to this moment. Louis told stories about the early days of jazz in New Orleans, about the mentors who had shaped him and the obstacles he had overcome. Kirk shared his own experiences growing up poor, working multiple jobs, fighting for every opportunity in an industry that did not make things easy for anyone. Helen served them with quiet professionalism, bringing their wine, taking their orders, checking on them periodically to make sure everything was satisfactory. She tried not to stare, but she could not help listening to fragments of their conversation, fascinated by these 2 remarkable men who seemed so comfortable with each other despite coming from such different worlds. The other diners gradually returned to their own meals and conversations. Some cast disapproving glances toward the table by the window, others seemed curious, even impressed. A few nodded at Kirk and Louis as if to express silent support. The atmosphere in the restaurant slowly relaxed, though a certain tension remained in the air throughout the meal. When the meal was finished and the bill arrived, Kirk and Louis called Helen over to their table. Kirk told her that they had noticed what she had done, how she had stepped forward when the manager was trying to turn them away, and they wanted her to know that her courage had not gone unnoticed. Louis nodded in agreement, his eyes warm with appreciation. Then Kirk placed something on the table that made Helen gasp. It was money, more money than Helen had ever seen in one place, more than she earned in several months of working at the restaurant. Kirk told her it was a thank you for treating them with dignity when she had every reason to be afraid, but that was not all. Louis added that he knew some people in the music education community, and if Helen or anyone in her family was interested in pursuing an education, he would be happy to help make that happen. Helen stood there, trembling, tears forming in her eyes. She tried to speak, to express her gratitude, but the words would not come. Kirk reached out and patted her hand gently. Louis smiled that famous smile, and Helen understood that her life had just changed in ways she could not yet fully comprehend. Kirk Douglas and Louis Armstrong walked out of that restaurant together, the same way they had walked in side by side as equals. Word of what had happened spread quickly through Hollywood. Some people criticized Kirk for making a scene, for pushing boundaries that did not need to be pushed, but many more admired him for taking a stand, for using his growing fame to make a statement about equality and respect. For Louis Armstrong, the lunch was a reminder that the world was slowly changing, that there were people willing to stand up against injustice even when it was easier to stay silent. He had experienced so much discrimination over the course of his life, had learned to navigate a world that often treated him as less than equal, despite his extraordinary talents. But moments like this one gave him hope that his children and grandchildren might live in a different world. Helen Dawson kept her job at the restaurant, partly because the manager did not want the additional scandal of firing the waitress who had served Kirk Douglas and Louis Armstrong, and partly because he recognized that she had shown more courage in that moment than he had shown in his entire career. But Helen did not stay at the restaurant much longer. True to his word, Louis Armstrong helped arrange for her to receive educational support, and within a year, Helen was enrolled in nursing school, pursuing a dream she had thought was forever out of reach. Years later, when Helen Dawson was a successful nurse with a family of her own, she often told the story of that day at the restaurant on Sunset Boulevard. She talked about how frightened she had been, how close she had come to doing nothing, how glad she was that she had found the courage to pick up those menus and lead those 2 men to their table. She talked about the kindness Kirk Douglas and Louis Armstrong had shown her, how their generosity had literally changed the course of her life. Kirk Douglas went on to become one of the biggest movie stars in Hollywood history, known not just for his powerful acting, but for his willingness to take courageous stands on difficult issues throughout his career. He produced films that challenged the blacklist, hired writers who had been banned from working, and consistently used his platform to advocate for justice and equality wherever he saw the need. The Lunch with Louis Armstrong was just one early example of the kind of person Kirk Douglas chose to be throughout his remarkable and inspiring life. Louis Armstrong continued to tour and record until his health no longer permitted it, bringing joy to millions around the world with his trumpet and his voice and his irrepressible spirit. He never stopped helping others, never stopped believing in the goodness of people, never stopped smiling even when the world gave him plenty of reasons to frown. The Lunch with Kirk Douglas was, for Louis, just another expression of who he had always been. A man who responded to kindness with kindness, who built bridges instead of walls, who believed that music and laughter and genuine human connection could overcome any obstacle that life placed in his path. Sometimes, the most important moments in history do not happen on battlefields or in government chambers. Sometimes they happen in restaurants, over lunch, between two people who decide that the way things have always been done is not the way things have to be. Kirk Douglas and Louis Armstrong shared a meal in 1949, and in doing so, they made a small but meaningful statement about the world they wanted to live in. They could not change everything. They could not end discrimination or prejudice or the countless injustices that still plagued American society. But they could treat each other with respect. They could stand together as equals. They could show a young waitress named Helen that courage is contagious, that one act of bravery can inspire another, that the world becomes a little bit better every time someone chooses to do the right thing, even when it is hard. That is the legacy of that lunch on Sunset Boulevard. Not just a story about two famous men breaking rules at a fancy restaurant, but a reminder that each of us has the power to make a difference, one small act of kindness and courage at a time. Kirk Douglas knew it. Louis Armstrong lived it every single day of his remarkable life. And Helen Dawson learned it on an ordinary afternoon that turned out to be anything but ordinary, a day that proved kindness never goes unrewarded and courage is always contagious. Thank you for watching this incredible story. If it inspired you, please subscribe and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that kindness and courage can change the world.